Welcome back. In a moment we'll examine whether air turbulence really is on the rise. But first, here are some other stories to keep an eye on. The French President François Hollande has said the UK must play its part in humanitarian efforts. The statement comes as the French Premier paid a visit to the port of Calais, meeting police, officials and politicians. During the visit, Hollande reiterated that the jungle migrant camp, which has become the home for up to 10,000 refugees and migrants, will be completely dismantled. Hundreds of demonstrators have taken to the world-famous canals of Venice to protest against the passage of huge cruise liners through the city. Lighting flares and blasting their horns, the protesters are calling for an end to the big ships landing in the historic city. Up to 30,000 people attend in high season. Residents remain stranded in parts of New South Wales region of Australia as floodwaters peak. Though rain has now eased, the floodwaters are expected to linger for a few more days, and an evacuation order remains in place for about 1,000 people. Residents have been forced to take to the water in boats in order to get around. Next on Insight, nervous flyers should look away, because if you hate the shakes that happen when you go through a patch of turbulence, we're about to hear a warning that air travel in future could become even choppier. The reason is climate change and the impact that ever-increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will have on the jet streams through which aircraft fly. And while most kinds of turbulence are easy to predict, the variety in question here, so-called clear air turbulence, comes out of the blue. That means that passengers and crew can be unprepared to deal with it and are at risk of injury. TadhgEnright reports.
For 45 terrifying minutes, this plane was shaken violently as it made its approach to Jakarta. Passengers raised their arms and prayed. Turbulence is usually predictable and short-lived, but this kind, so-called clear air turbulence, comes without warning. On the ground in Jakarta, 31 passengers were treated for injuries. 9 had to be taken to hospital. This kind of turbulence is rare, but it's also hard to forecast. Injuries can happen when people aren't prepared, when they're not wearing seatbelts. Paul Williams is an atmospheric scientist who fears there'll be more injuries from clear air turbulence in future.
I actually started out in this business trying to improve the turbulence predictions.
And when he did, he realised there'd been very little research into the impact of climate change.
What is clear air turbulence?
Well, clear air turbulence is a particular kind of turbulence in the atmosphere. The special thing about it is that it's invisible to the pilot, actually also invisible to the electronics on board the plane, and that's why it's a particularly hazardous form of turbulence that causes lots of injuries.
Clear air turbulence happens when a plane moves across the edges of the fast-flowing air currents that we call jet streams. Here, high-speed winds and slower-moving air going in different directions can cause sudden and violent movements to passing aircraft. So violent that if passengers aren't wearing seatbelts, they can be thrown from their seats, potentially hitting the ceiling with dangerous consequences.
So why do you think it's going to get worse?
Well, the carbon dioxide that we're putting into the atmosphere is of course changing the temperatures at ground level where we live. We know that very well now. Actually, it's also changing the temperatures higher up in the atmosphere too. 30 to 35,000 feet, the temperatures are changing, and it's those temperatures that actually drive the jet stream. So by changing the temperatures, we're changing the jet stream and we're increasing the instabilities within the jet stream.
High levels of traffic in the sky also plays a part, not just because more journeys raises the risk of injuries from turbulence, but because more traffic in the air forces planes to follow routes that pilots would prefer to avoid.
Take, for example, the North Atlantic. There are a number of tracks that you can fly, and airlines will choose those tracks based on tailwind, preferably, and also to avoid areas of severe turbulence. But because there are so many aircraft now, all the tracks are taken up, and indeed many of the levels as well. So often you don't really have an option, and you could end up in a track that you wouldn't have chosen. if we do have a heating up atmosphere, then we're going to have more extremes of weather, and we're going to have a more active atmosphere, because the sun is the power behind all our weather.
So what's it going to mean for air travel?
So I think we're talking about bumpier flights, maybe the seatbelt sign being switched on for perhaps twice as much as it has been historically, more diversions and delays, because to divert around turbulence has a time cost associated with it, also a fuel cost. So people might potentially see the ticket prices going up in future as well.
Frightening as turbulence can be, it's still true that travel by air is the safest. But just like we do on the road, always wearing a seatbelt in the sky could become the preferred way to fly. TadhgEnright reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss that further, I'm joined by the travel journalist and broadcaster Simon Calder. You must have experienced a fair bit of turbulence in your time, Simon?
Well, I have, and I'm sure that many of the other frequent flyers have done this. Interestingly, not in places you would expect it necessarily to happen. So just on a short domestic hop in New Zealand, for example, flying from Vienna to Cairo, going over the Balkans, it was extremely unpleasant, and then pretty much from one end of Ukraine to the other. And that was aboard the world's biggest passenger jet, the A380. But I absolutely sympathise with the passengers we saw in those clips. It is extremely uncomfortable and, for a lot of anxious flyers, deeply worrying.
It is, isn't it? Are there parts of the world where it is more prevalent than others?
Well, you can look at various charts, and you can say that if you're within, I think, 150 miles of nautical miles of a jet stream core, then there is a higher increased chance of having clear air turbulence. But the whole thing about it is that nobody knows for certain. It's all to do with the relative speed of air masses, which is all tied up with temperature, as we were hearing in TadhgEnright's report, and ultimately you are just flying along and suddenly you are then in an extremely unstable environment. If you can imagine an airliner actually going through water, you want it to be nice and smooth. If suddenly, without any warning at all, you hit a whirlpool, that is going to be very, very unpleasant. But in terms of the airframe itself, it should not these days be fatal.
These days? I mean, is there anything record where turbulence has actually broken an aircraft up, which is what everyone's worst nightmare, isn't it?
Of course, and all those poor passengers are thinking, oh, look, the wings are going to fall off, we're all doomed. And look, I completely sympathise with their anxiety. Luckily, in recent times, there is no evidence of that happening. There are, if you trawl back half a century, for instance, there's a case of a British airliner flying near Mount Fuji in Japan, which broke up in midair, and it's thought that clear air turbulence could have caused that tragic accident. These days, though, it's much more to do with making sure that you're not actually harmed by what's going on in the cabin. And so where we heard then, keep your seatbelt fastened, of course, the pilots will do that at all times when they're seated, and as a passenger, I try to make sure I do it as well.
And is this part of the insurance mindset now of a company, that they will leave the seatbelt sign, keep the seatbelt sign on for a lot longer to avoid that accidental injury?
There may be an element of that, depending, I imagine, on how litigious each nationality perhaps is regarded. But
I hear American pilots are more likely to leave the sign on.
Well,
in your experience, that's true?
I think there's in many spheres in the US, there's a culture of erring on the side of caution, legally speaking. But really, it's striking a balance, and I'm afraid that we will probably see that, yes, the seatbelt sign will go on, but that's probably, judging from the excellent report there, because it needs to.
What are you hearing from the meteorologists? Is it right that this increase in CO2 emissions, the global warming argument, climate change argument, is increasing the incidence of clear air turbulence?
It was a dramatic increase in the cases we were hearing about, which doesn't quite correlate with what we would expect in terms of temperature changes. It may simply be a question of pilots being more prepared to report it. However, certainly if predictions about the changing in air temperature happen, then it is entirely likely that we may see an increase in it. But of course, more of us are flying all the time, and therefore there are bound to be more cases simply because of the sheer number of us travelling.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that with all the technology available, in the meteorological space, in air travel, in mapping and GPS locations and so on. The actual fluid mechanics of all this, being able to predict it, it's still not there, is it? We don't have instrumentation that will predict clear air turbulence.
No, I mean, there are things you could do. You could get a whole lot of weather satellites and keep them in position, but that would itself, sorry, not satellites, but weather balloons, that would itself present a hazard. So, of course, that wouldn't be plausible. No, I mean, aviation is getting safer and safer. I dare say that we will come up with some really smart radar, but I'm afraid it's not yet. So, as we heard in that report, keep your seatbelt fastened.
Keep strapped in. Simon, good to talk to you. Simon Calder, thank you. Now, we end with our Insight Bite. This is a little something that we feel you should know. And tonight, we're looking at the world's largest radio telescope, which has started its first testing phase. Chinese scientists report that the giant dish, which measures 500 meters across, you heard that right, is now complete, and it's received its first signals from space. It will now take 3 more years to calibrate the instrument so it can become fully operational. Once it does, it seems nothing will be out of China's view. And that's all for now. I'm Martin Stanford. That was Insight.